It is 8 o'clock in the evening on Chepstow Villas, in the Bayswater quarter of London, and rain has been coming down since 4. Come in out of it, pull the blanket up if you have not already, or find one now. Because where we are going tonight, the only real light comes from a coal fire banked low behind an iron guard, 3 flights above the street, in a room that smells of camphor and lavender water and something warmer underneath it. Milk left too long on the hob, perhaps, or simply the smell of a small sleeping head against a pillow. We are going to spend a night in a Victorian nursery. Not the nursery you have seen painted and photographed 1,000 times, though there is a rocking horse here with a real horsehair mane, and a shelf of tin soldiers standing at careless attention, and a paper on the walls printed with rambling pink roses that any children's illustrator would recognize on sight. This is the room underneath that picture. The one that keeps the same rocking horse and the same roses, but also keeps a woman awake long past midnight in a wicker chair that has learned exactly how to creak without waking anyone, listening for the sound of a child's breathing changing in the dark. Get settled. Turn the room around you down as low as it will go. We have a long night ahead. From this hour, 8 o'clock, through to the grey hour before dawn, when the fire is nothing but a handful of orange coals and the fog outside has swallowed the street lamps whole. By the time we reach that hour together, I think you will know this nursery and the woman who ran it rather better than the postcard version most of us carry around without ever examining it. The rooms themselves, when we finally reach them, hold the kind of clutter that only ever accumulates around small children, wooden building blocks stacked in a low basket by the fender, a doll with one shoe missing propped against the day nursery's single armchair, a row of picture books with soft, worn corners lined up on a shelf just low enough for small hands to reach. None of it matches in the way a drawing room downstairs would insist on matching. It simply gathers, layer upon layer, the way a life lived mostly indoors gathers its own comfortable disorder, and there is a kind of honesty in that clutter that the more formal rooms below stairs rarely allow themselves. Let us go up. The staircase narrows as it climbs. The carpet, good wool on the first floor, thins to drug it by the second, and by the third it is given up altogether, worn boards creaking under a strip of oilcloth. The air gets cooler with every landing, then warmer again all at once as a door opens onto firelight. Behind that door, on a hook worn pale by small, searching hands, hangs a china handle. Someone is turning it now. Before we step through, a word about what we are doing here tonight, because I want you to know exactly where you are. We are going to follow one household, one family, one nursery, across a single evening and night in November of 1888, from the last hour before bedtime through to the hour the coal fire finally goes out. There is a woman at the center of this story whose name most people never learned even when she was standing in the same room as them. And there are 3 children who trusted her with something their own parents, for reasons the era made almost unavoidable, could not always give them. We are going to watch her bathe them, dress them for bed, read to them, pray with them, and then sit up through the coldest hours of the night listening for the sound of a cough that might be nothing, or might be croup, in a decade before anyone quite understood what caused either. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening you come here for, if you would rather visit a place than memorize a fact about it, I would be glad if you subscribed. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you would like more evenings like this one. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are tonight and whether it is raining there too. I do read them, more often than you would think. Wherever you are and whatever hour it is, I am glad to have your company. We know this room, or think we do, from 100 paintings and postcards and picture books. A rocking horse, a fire, a woman singing softly in a rocking chair while snow, or in tonight's case rain, falls harmlessly outside. That image has survived because there is real comfort in it, and comfort, properly earned, is not something we need to apologize for or explain away. But comfort built on an incomplete picture eventually feels thin, the way a story feels thin when you sense, without being told, that something has been left out of it. Tonight we are going to fill in what usually gets left out, gently, without losing the warmth that drew you to this story in the first place. The version of this world most of us carry is a pleasant one, and it is not entirely wrong. There really was a rocking horse. There really was a fire, and really were roses on the wallpaper. But a nursery in 1888 was also a small, isolated kingdom at the top of a tall house, run largely by one underpaid, unmarried woman who was mother and nurse and teacher and disciplinarian all at once, and who could be dismissed with a week's notice if the lady of the house decided she did not care for her tone. Tonight we are going to hold both of those truths at the same time, the warmth and the weight of it, because neither one makes sense without the other. It is 1888. The rain has been falling on London since mid-afternoon, and it shows no sign of stopping before morning. Let us step inside and see what an evening looked like from the inside of that room at the top of the house. Chepstow Villas runs in a long curve through Bayswater, a district built in the middle decades of the century on what had been market gardens and gravel pits, and by 1888 it has settled into itself the way a coat settles onto a familiar pair of shoulders. The houses along it are tall and stuccoed white at the front, 4 stories and a basement, with black iron railings guarding areas that drop down to the kitchen doors below street level. Bathstone steps lead up to porticoed front entrances painted in the deep greens and maroons that were considered respectable rather than showy. Behind the white stucco, the brick is ordinary London stock brick, soot-darkened already. Because nothing in this city stays clean for long once the coal fires of a million chimneys have had their say. November in London carries its own distinct character, different from the fog of true winter, and different again from the damp chill of autumn's earlier weeks. The days have shortened enough now that darkness settles by 4:30, and the sun, on the rare afternoon it appears at all, sits low and pale behind a permanent haze that never quite burns off. Housewives across the district have already had their chimneys swept in preparation for the months of heavy firing ahead, and every open window on the few dry days this month has let in the smell of wet fallen leaves from the plane trees lining the wider streets, mixing with everything else the city contributes to its own strange, sooty version of autumn. And it is the coal that you would notice first, stepping onto this street tonight. Every house is burning it, in the kitchen range, in the dining room grate, in the nursery fire 3 floors up, and the smoke from 10,000 chimneys settles over Bayswater as a low brown haze that mixes with the rain to produce something closer to a taste than a smell. Faintly sulphurous, catching at the back of the throat. Underneath it runs the smell of wet horse, because the street is busy even at this hour with cab horses working the last fares of the evening, their hooves striking sparks off wet cobblestone, their breath showing white in the lamplight. A muffin man's bell sounded an hour ago and has since gone quiet. Somewhere 2 streets over, a barrel organ is grinding out a tune nobody asked for, and a costermonger's cart, empty now, its owner gone home, sits abandoned against a lamppost until morning. The gas lamps along the terrace burn with a soft, unsteady yellow that does not so much light the street as suggest where the darkness has agreed not to go. A lamplighter came through around 5 with his long pole and will come through again before dawn to put them out. Between the lamps, the rain falls through darkness that feels, if you have only ever known electric light, remarkably total. A policeman on his beat passes with a bullseye lantern at his belt, testing a door handle here and there out of habit more than suspicion. Because Bayswater in 1888 is a district of clerks and professionals and prosperous tradesmen. Not the kind of place where trouble is expected, though trouble, that autumn, is very much on London's mind in other quarters of the city we will not visit tonight. A few streets south, Westbourne Grove has, over the past 2 decades, grown into one of the great shopping streets of this side of London. its plate glass windows lit tonight by gas even at this hour. Drapers and confectioners and a grand new department store or two competing for the custom of exactly the households that line Chepstow villas and streets like it. By day it hums with delivery carts and errand boys and nursemaids sent out to match a length of ribbon or collect a parcel, the commercial engine that keeps a district like this one fed, clothed and properly turned out. By this hour of the evening it has mostly gone quiet, shutters coming down one by one, though a chemist's shop 2 doors from the corner still shows a light. The small tin of camphorated oil we will need before the night is finished sitting, at this exact moment, on a shelf inside it, waiting for someone to need it, though nobody in the house yet knows it will be Theodore. The economics of a street like this are worth pausing over, because they explain everything that happens once we go inside. A house on Chepstow Villas rents for perhaps £130 a year. A substantial sum. The kind of figure that puts these houses well beyond a bank clerk earning £90 a year, but comfortably within reach of a solicitor, a surgeon, a prosperous merchant, the sort of man whose income runs to £400 or £500 annually and who is expected, by the unwritten rules of his class, to keep at least 3 servants to prove it. A loaf of bread costs somewhere around 4p halfpenny. A pound of good beef runs to about 10p. A live-in nursery nurse, the woman we are about to meet, earns something in the region of £20 to £25 a year, paid quarterly, with her board and a narrow iron bed found, set against the rent of the house she works in. Her whole year's wage would not cover 5 months of it. This is the arithmetic underneath the roses on the nursery wallpaper, and we will return to it properly later in the evening, because the numbers deserve more than a passing mention. It is worth saying plainly, before we move on, that none of this struck anyone living on this street as an injustice worth remarking upon. It struck them, almost universally, as the simple and permanent shape of a well-ordered world, the kind of arrangement so deeply embedded in daily life that questioning it would have seemed, to nearly everyone involved, faintly absurd, rather like questioning why rain fell downward instead of up. For now, look up. Behind the white stucco fronts, the houses climb in a strict architecture of class that any Londoner of this era could read the way we read a map. The ground floor holds the dining room, its table long enough for 10, its sideboard set with silver polished weekly by the parlourmaid, and, at the back, the morning room where the lady of the house receives calls and answers correspondence at a small writing desk angled to catch the best of whatever light the season allows. The first floor, reached by a wide, well-carpeted staircase with a mahogany rail polished daily by a housemaid's elbow grease, holds the drawing room, kept for evenings and for guests, its curtains already drawn against the wet dark outside. The second floor holds the principal bedrooms, the master's and mistress's rooms, warmed properly, furnished well, and then, at the very top of the house, up a second staircase that grows narrower and plainer with every step, carpeted in drugget rather than wool, lit by a single gas bracket rather than a chandelier, sits the nursery floor. This vertical arrangement was not an accident, and it was not cruelty exactly, though it reads that way to us now. It reflected a set of beliefs about children that most middle-class Victorians would have considered simple common sense. Children were noisy, and noise disturbed a household's proper order. Children were prone to illness, and illness in an age that had only the vaguest understanding of infection was safer kept at a remove. And children, frankly, were not yet fully formed people in the way an adult was a formed person. They needed managing, more than they needed the constant presence of their parents, and managing was best done by a specialist in a specialist room, tucked as far from the rest of the household's business as the architecture would allow. So the nursery sits at the top, behind a door that muffles sound rather better than you would expect, in 2 connected rooms. The day nursery, where meals are taken and lessons conducted and toys kept in a low cupboard along one wall. And behind it, through a second door, the night nursery, where the beds are. 3 of them tonight, 2 small cots with turned wooden rails, and, in the corner nearest the fire, a narrow iron bedstead of the kind found in a servant's room anywhere in the house. Because that is precisely what it is. The woman who sleeps in it, when she sleeps at all, is a servant, whatever affection the children upstairs come to feel for her, and the room reflects that fact plainly, right down to the thinness of its blanket compared to the eider-down 2 floors below. Below street level, reached by its own separate stair and its own separate door under the front steps, sits the kitchen and the servants' hall, a world the family upstairs enters perhaps twice a year, and the nursery enters even less often than that. It is warmer down there most evenings than anywhere else in the house, heat radiating constantly off the great iron range that Mrs. Dawson the cook commands like a small kingdom of her own. And it smells permanently of whatever has been roasted, boiled or baked that day, layered over decades of the same smells repeated until they have become simply the smell of the room itself. The servants eat there together at hours dictated by the family's own meals rather than by any clock of their choosing, snatching their dinner between courses sent up and courses cleared away, and it is one of the few rooms in the entire house where 6 people who spend their days answering to the family upstairs can, for a stolen half-hour, answer to nothing but each other. The fire in the night nursery grate is the one indulgence the household allows without argument, because a chill in a child's room was, in 1888, not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely frightening, associated as it was with croup and bronchitis and the general category of ailment a Victorian family called, with a vagueness that covered a multitude of real dangers. A delicate chest. The coal for that fire is counted out by the scuttle and noted in the household books, the same books that track the 4pence halfpenny loaves and the 10pence beef, because a well-run middle-class house in 1888 ran on ledgers as much as it ran on love, and the two were not considered to be in conflict at all. There is a wider unease abroad in London this autumn that a street like Chepstow Villas feels only distantly. The way you feel weather happening somewhere else. 3 miles east, in Whitechapel, the newspapers have spent months describing a series of murders that has unsettled the whole city, and the name of the killer nobody has caught turns up in nursery maids' whispered conversations in Kensington Gardens, in servants' hall gossip, in the anxious letters women like Nurse Hartley write home to mothers in Norfolk and Suffolk and Kent, asking whether the trouble has reached this far west yet, and being reassured, correctly as it happens, that it has not. Bayswater in 1888 is a comfortable, watched, gaslit district, its policemen well known by sight, its streets busy with exactly the kind of respectable evening traffic that discourages the sort of danger London is currently, elsewhere, learning to fear. The unease still presses at the edges of things, a reminder that the city containing this warm, well-ordered nursery is also, a few miles off, capable of holding something considerably darker, and that the safety inside this particular house is neither universal nor guaranteed. Only, for this family, on this street, still holding. Closer to home, the sounds of an ordinary evening continue regardless. A church clock, St. Matthew's a few streets off, strikes the half-hour with a heavy, resonant note that carries clearly through the wet air. Somewhere below, a delivery boy is finishing his rounds later than usual, his handcart wheels clattering over a loose paving stone, and the smell of frying fish drifts faintly from a shop 2 corners away, mixing with coal smoke and wet stone and the ever-present undertone of horse. A dog barks twice at something in the mews behind the terrace and is quiet again. This is the ordinary music of a London evening in 1888, unremarkable to anyone living inside it, and entirely gone now, replaced by sounds none of these people would recognize, which is one of the quiet privileges of visiting a place like this only in imagination. We hear it exactly as it was, undisturbed by anything that came after. Let us climb the last flight now, past the drugget and the single gas bracket, to the door with the china handle. Behind it, the fire is doing its work, and someone is waiting for us. Her name is Constance Hartley, And on this November evening in 1888, she is 33 years old, unmarried, and has been in service since she was 15. She is not a real woman whose grave you could visit, but she is built from women who were, drawn from diaries, wage books, household manuals, and the recollections that grown children left behind about the women who raised them. Everything about her is representative rather than singular, which is to say she is more real, not less, because 100 women like her lived exactly this kind of evening in exactly this kind of house. She came up from a village outside Norwich, the third of 6 children born to a carpenter and his wife, and she went into service the way most girls of her background did, not from any settled calling, but because a farm labourer's daughter with 6 siblings needed a wage and a roof. And domestic service offered both with more reliability than most alternatives open to her. She began as a nursery maid at 15, the lowest rung of the nursery hierarchy, emptying slops and mending stockings and carrying coal up 4 flights of stairs for a woman very much like the one she has now become. By 22, she had her own charges. By 28, she had references good enough and a manner steady enough to be trusted with the Marchmont household, where she has now worked for 5 years. The household itself is a comfortable one by the standards of its street. Charles Marchmont is a solicitor with an office near Lincoln's Inn, a partner rather than a clerk, which places the family solidly in the professional middle class rather than at its uncertain edges. He leaves the house each weekday morning by 8:30, returns most evenings by 7, and treats the nursery, on the rare occasions he visits it at all, with a kind of formal, well-meaning courtesy that suggests a man slightly unsure of the correct register to use with his own small children, a manner he did not choose so much as inherit from his own father before him. His wife, Louisa Marchmont, keeps a proper calling day every Tuesday afternoon, receiving other wives of the district over tea and thin bread and butter in the drawing-room below, and sits besides on the committee of a charitable society organized for the relief of poor lying-in women, a properly useful cause to which she devotes real hours of correspondence and fundraising, evidence, if any were needed, that her attention was not idle even when it was directed away from her own household. She has never in her married life bathed one of her own children, a fact she would not think to apologize for any more than she would apologize for not blacking her own grates. Below Nurse Hartley in the household hierarchy sits a nursery maid named Ivy, 15 years old, who does for the nursery roughly what Nurse Hartley once did at the same age, and who sleeps in a small room off the night nursery reserved for exactly that purpose. Below both of them, in the wider household, work a cook, a housemaid, and a parlour-maid, along with a manservant who comes in by the day. It is, in the accounting of the era, a properly staffed house, 6 servants for a family of 5, and Nurse Hartley sits roughly in the middle of that servant hierarchy, above the maids of all work, decisively below the housekeeper posts kept in grander establishments, and entirely outside the family whose children call her by a name closer to mother than employer. There are 3 children in her care tonight. Theodore, 6 years old, recently breeched, which is to say recently graduated from the skirts every small boy wore until an age his parents judged appropriate, and now dressed in his first proper little suits, a change of costume that Victorian households treated as a genuine milestone in a child's life. Alice, 3, still in the last of her babyhood petticoats. Fierce-tempered in a way Nurse Hartley privately finds more promising than alarming. The kind of child who announces her opinions to the whole nursery whether or not anyone has asked for them, and who Nurse Hartley suspects, quietly, will grow into a considerably more interesting woman than the household currently has any reason to expect. And Cecily, 7 months old, the youngest, still entirely dependent, still waking twice most nights, still the reason Nurse Hartley's own sleep, on any given evening, is more theory than practice. Nurse Hartley's days are governed by a printed nursery timetable pinned inside the linen cupboard door. the kind sold in stationers' shops and reproduced in household manuals of the period, dividing each day into blocks for rising, washing, breakfast, airing, lessons, dinner, rest, tea, play, and bed. Each block assigned its proper hour with a precision that would not look out of place in a railway timetable. She did not write this schedule. Mrs. Marchmont selected it from a manual and had it copied out in a clear hand, and Nurse Hartley has spent 5 years learning exactly how much give the schedule actually has, which is more than the printed version suggests and considerably less than the children would prefer. Here is a humanizing detail worth knowing about her, because it is the kind of thing that makes a person real rather than a type. Nurse Hartley reads, not often, and never for long, because her evenings belong to other people's children rather than to herself, but she keeps a single novel on the shelf above her narrow bed, worked through a page or two at a time over months. And she has strong, entirely private opinions about it that she has never once voiced to anyone in the house. Because a nursery nurse's opinions on literature were not considered part of her professional remit. She thinks the heroine of her current book a fool for trusting the wrong brother, and she has thought so for 11 weeks now, several pages at a time, and she rather enjoys being the only person in London who knows it. The book itself, a penny weekly serial passed to her by a fellow nurse she met in the gardens 2 winters ago and never properly returned, sits wedged between a Bible and a worn devotional volume that Mrs. Marchmont approved for the nursery shelf without ever inspecting what stood beside it, and there is a small, private satisfaction in that too. The quiet knowledge that her own inner life occupies a shelf her employer has looked at 100 times without ever truly seeing. Tonight is, in the ordinary sense, nothing special. There is no visitor expected, no illness declared, no occasion marked on the household calendar. And that is precisely why it is worth watching closely, because an ordinary November evening, followed all the way through, tells you more about a life than the exceptional ones ever do. Theodore has a slight rasp in his chest that Nurse Hartley noticed at breakfast and has been quietly watching all day, the kind of thing that in this decade could mean nothing at all, or could mean the first hour of a genuine crisis, and there is no way, in 1888, to know in advance which it will turn out to be. Alice has been fractious since her afternoon nap was cut short. Cecily is teething, gums swollen and hot, in the miserable, wordless way that infants that age simply endure. None of this would appear in a photograph of the nursery. All of it is the actual texture of the evening ahead. We have met her now at the hour we started from, 8 o'clock. Rain on the glass, fire in the grate. But to understand this evening properly, we need to go back and pick up the day where she picked it up herself, which was well before the sun did. A nursery day did not begin at tea time. It began in the dark, and so shall we. It is 6:15 in the morning, and the house is entirely silent except for the nursery. Nurse Hartley has been awake for perhaps 10 minutes, roused not by any clock but by the small, reliable internal mechanism that 5 years of this work has built into her, and her first act of the day, before she has properly opened her own eyes, is to slide out from under her thin blanket and cross the cold floorboards to the grate, where the coals banked the night before have burned down to a dull red glow beneath a fine grey ash. She works the poker gently, feeds in a few pieces of kindling kept in a scuttle by the fender, and coaxes the fire back up before the room has time to lose the warmth it built overnight. This is not a small task. A nursery kept cold in November was, by the medical thinking of the day, an invitation to exactly the chest complaints every mother in London lived in low-grade dread of, and the maintenance of that fire, hour by hour, day and night, sits near the top of Nurse Hartley's actual, unwritten job description, well above anything printed on the schedule pinned inside the linen cupboard door. Ivy, the nursery maid, is up within minutes of her, and together they move through the room's morning choreography with the practiced quiet of people who have done this hundreds of times before. Ivy carries up the first cans of hot water from the kitchen range 4 floors below, a climb she will make 3 or 4 times before breakfast is finished, her arms aching by the second trip in a way she has learned not to mention to anyone. Because complaint was not a currency this household dealt in from a girl her age and her station, and Nurse Hartley lays out the day's clothes across the fireguard to warm, small woolen combinations. A flannel petticoat for Alice, the stiff white collar and short jacket that mark Theodore as a properly breeched young gentleman rather than a baby in skirts. She checks each garment for damp with real vigilance, because a chill picked up from cold linen was, in the medical understanding of 1888, a plausible first cause of the fevers that killed children with a regularity we would now find unbearable. Theodore wakes first, as he generally does, sitting bolt upright in his small bed the instant the room brightens, and Nurse Hartley's attention goes immediately to his breathing before it goes to anything else, because the rasp she noticed yesterday has not entirely gone. She lays 2 fingers against his chest through his nightshirt, listens to the rhythm of it, and decides, for the moment, that it will keep. Alice wakes crossly, as she generally does, and requires roughly 10 minutes of patient, unhurried handling before she will consent to being washed, which Nurse Hartley provides without any visible sign of the fatigue it costs her. Cecily is already awake in her cot, has been for a while by the look of her, gums swollen from teething, and takes to her morning wash with the outrage of an infant who would very much prefer to be held instead. The washing itself is done in cold water, by long-standing custom, even for the youngest child, on the theory, widely held and rarely questioned, that cold water in the morning built constitution and character in equal measure. Nurse Hartley does not entirely believe this, privately, watching Cecily's furious little face at the touch of the flannel. But she does it anyway, because it is what every household manual instructs and what every mother of her acquaintance expects, and a nursery nurse's private doubts, however reasonable, were not generally consulted. Breakfast, once all 3 are washed and dressed, is bread and milk for Cecily, softened to a paste, and porridge for Theodore and Alice. Plain, unsalted, sweetened with nothing stronger than a very small spoon of golden syrup on special mornings, which this is not. There is toast for Nurse Hartley and Ivy, taken standing at the nursery table between spoonfuls administered to the children, eaten in the fragmented way that anyone who has fed small children before feeding themselves will recognize instantly. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely if you have only ever imagined the nursery nurse as a figure of leisure presiding gently over play. She eats when the children allow it, in whatever order the morning's demands assign, and some mornings that means her own breakfast happens in 4 separate bites over the course of an hour. At 8:30, the children are taken down to the morning room for what the household calls the children's hour, though it rarely lasts a full hour, and this is the daily audience with their parents that most Victorian children in households of this kind actually received. Mrs. Marchmont receives them in a good dressing gown, kisses each child once, asks Theodore whether he has been a good boy, and Alice whether she has minded her nurse, and receives brief, satisfactory answers before turning her attention back to the morning's post. Mr. Marchmont, if he is not already gone to his office near Lincoln's Inn, offers a similarly brief and warm but limited exchange. Now, here is where most people get this wrong, imagining this arrangement as coldness on the parents' part. It was not experienced, by most families living it, as coldness at all. It was simply the shape family life took, structured by a set of assumptions about a child's proper development that placed the mother's role as one of moral oversight and occasional tenderness rather than daily physical care, a division of labour that struck the Marchmonts, and thousands like them, as entirely sensible rather than as any kind of failure of feeling. By 9, the children are back upstairs, and the morning's true business begins, which is airing. Whatever the weather, and this November has offered very little encouragement, children of this age and class were walked out daily, on the conviction that fresh air, however cold or damp, was essential to a child's constitution in a way indoor confinement could never be. Today, it means Kensington Gardens, a 15-minute walk each way. Theodore in his short jacket and a good wool overcoat, Alice bundled to the point of near immobility, Cecily wheeled in a wicker perambulator with a hood raised against the drizzle that has not quite decided whether to become genuine rain. Ivy pushes the perambulator. Nurse Hartley walks alongside, one hand firmly around Theodore's, the other free to catch Alice, who has a documented habit of wandering toward puddles with the single-mindedness of a much older explorer. The gardens at this hour hold a whole society of their own, nursery maids and nurses from up and down the district, walking their own small charges along the same gravel paths, exchanging brief nods and occasional gossip in the particular shorthand of women who share a profession without ever quite being permitted to call it that in polite company. Nurse Hartley knows several of them by sight, one or two well enough to trade a sentence about a mistress's temper or a child's teething. And this small, daily society, unremarked by the families who employ them, is very nearly the only adult companionship most of these women have in a day otherwise spent entirely with people under the age of 7. A stranger passing through the gardens this morning would notice nothing more than a handful of women pushing prams and minding toddlers, an entirely unremarkable scene repeated in parks across the whole of London, with no way of knowing that this loose daily gathering functioned, for the women inside it, as something close to a trade guild without a name. A place where wages were compared, difficult mistresses discussed, and a girl newly arrived from the country quietly steered toward a household known to treat its servants decently rather than one known to do the opposite. Just before the gardens, at the corner of the square, the milk cart makes its slow rounds, a heavy churn on a hand barrow pushed by a boy not much older than Ivy, ladling milk straight into whatever jug each house sends out to meet him. Unpasteurized and only as clean as the churn and the boy's own hands allow it to be. Which is one of the quieter dangers of 1888 that no household manual quite manages to address head-on. Nurse Hartley has long since adopted the habit, taught to her by an older nurse in her first situation, of scalding Cecily's milk properly on the nursery stove before it ever reaches the baby's cup. A precaution against the kind of summer sickness that carried off more infants in a hot August than almost any other single cause. Though this November morning the risk is smaller, and the habit, by now, simply automatic. On the walk home, the postboy passes them going the other way, and Nurse Hartley recognizes, tucked among the letters he carries, the familiar slant hand of her own mother writing from Norfolk. A letter that will not actually reach the nursery until the afternoon delivery. But the sight of the boy's satchel is enough to set off a small, familiar ache, because a woman in service this far from home learned early to ration her homesickness carefully in small doses rather than let it interrupt a morning's work. Ivy, walking beside her, mentions that her own mother wrote last week to say the youngest of her 6 brothers has gone into a boot factory in Northampton, a piece of news delivered lightly but carrying, underneath it, the same quiet arithmetic every servant's family in England was doing constantly in 1888, sorting children out into whatever paid position could be found for them the moment they were old enough to be spared from home. Ivy herself came into service at 13, 2 years younger than Nurse Hartley had been, sent up from Kent by a father who worked a small holding too small to support 7 children on it, and she speaks of her own family without bitterness, in the same matter-of-fact tone she uses to describe the weather, because this was simply how a girl of her station expected her life to begin. The walk back is slower than the walk out, Theodore's steps dragging slightly, Alice demanding to be told, for perhaps the 100th time, the name of every dog they pass, real or imagined, and Nurse Hartley answering each invented name with the same patient seriousness she brings to everything else the day asks of her. By the time the house comes back into view, its white stucco front looking, in the grey morning light, exactly like every other house on the terrace, the whole small party is glad of the coming warmth, and Nurse Hartley finds herself doing the quiet, automatic reckoning that fills so much of her day, listening to Theodore's breathing as he climbs the front steps, deciding that the walk, at least, does not seem to have done him any harm. Back at the house by 10, there are lessons conducted at the low nursery table because a boy of 6 was expected to be making steady progress with his letters and his numbers well before he was old enough for a proper schoolroom or a governess of his own. Theodore's tin soldiers arranged along the windowsill in the day nursery wear the red coats and pith helmets of a British regiment on colonial service, toys manufactured by the thousand for exactly this purpose. Teaching small boys across the whole of England the shapes and colours of an empire most of them would never personally see, long before any schoolroom got the chance to teach it more formally. Theodore knows none of this consciously. He knows only that the soldiers must stand in straight lines, that the cavalry goes on the left, and that Alice is never, under any circumstances, to be trusted with the general, a rule he enforces with the absolute seriousness only a 6-year-old can bring to an entirely invented hierarchy. He traces his letters onto a slate now with a squeaking pencil that makes Alice giggle every single time. And Nurse Hartley corrects his grip more than his spelling, because her own education, though real, was never extensive enough to make her entirely confident teaching sums past simple addition. Alice, too young for the slate, is set to threading large wooden beads onto a cord, an occupation that keeps her hands busy and her opinions for a merciful quarter hour, largely to herself. It is 10:30 now, and the morning, such as it has been, is nearly spent. Theodore's cough returns twice during his letters, brief but not nothing, and Nurse Hartley makes a private note of it the way she makes private notes of everything that might matter later, filing it away against the rest of the day's demands. Because a nursery nurse's real skill, more than any single task, is holding a dozen such small observations in her head at once, waiting to see which of them, by evening, will turn out to have mattered after all. A nursery nurse in Nurse Hartley's position earned, in 1888, about £24 a year. The numbers are worth pausing over, because they explain more about this household than any single scene we could watch. £24 a year works out to roughly 9 shillings a week, paid quarterly rather than weekly, with board, lodging, and a uniform allowance found on top. Set that beside Ivy's wage as under nurse, closer to £8 or £10 a year at 15, rising slowly as she ages into more responsibility. Set it beside the cook's wage, likely £18 to £22, reflecting a skill considered more technical and harder to replace than childcare, which the era largely regarded as an extension of ordinary womanly instinct rather than a trained profession at all. Set it beside a governess who might teach the same Theodore his French and his catechism a few years hence, earning anywhere from £35 to £80, depending on her own family's respectability. Because a governess was, crucially, a poor relation of the gentry rather than a servant, and the wage gap between her and Nurse Hartley reflected class origin nearly as much as it reflected the actual work performed. Against all of this, set the house itself, renting at somewhere near £130 a year, and Mr. Marchmont's own income, likely £400 to £500 annually from his solicitor's practice. The 6 servants below his roof, added together, cost him perhaps £110 a year in wages, plus their keep, which is to say close to a quarter of his income, went toward the staff required to run a household that looked, to the street outside, entirely effortless. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. The stillness of a well-run Victorian house, the sense that everything simply happened, meals appearing, fires lit, children washed and dressed, was not effortlessness at all. It was a substantial ongoing expenditure, carefully managed, that bought the appearance of ease precisely by keeping its own labour invisible. It helps, too, to picture what £24 actually bought a woman like Nurse Hartley across a full year of careful saving. It might, eventually, furnish a small cottage room somewhere in retirement, or provide a modest dowry toward a late marriage. Should one ever present itself, or simply sit, as it mostly did, in a post office savings book as insurance against the one outcome every servant without family wealth behind her feared above all others, which was growing too old or too ill to work and having nowhere left to turn. Nurse Hartley's £24, set against her employer's several hundred, meant she could not have afforded to rent so much as a single floor of the house she ran. It meant that if she saved every spare shilling for a decade, she would still not have accumulated what Mrs. Marchmont might spend on a single good winter coat and its trimmings. It also meant, and this is worth sitting with, that a woman entrusted with 3 children's health, safety, education, and moral formation, effectively their whole daily existence, earned less in a year than her employer's household spent on wallpaper and curtains for the drawing room alone. There is more to understand here about the material world of the nursery itself. The rocking horse downstairs, the good one with the real horsehair mane, cost somewhere in the region of £2 or £3 new, a substantial toy, roughly an eighth of Nurse Hartley's annual wage, purchased without a second thought by parents for whom that sum represented an afternoon's small indulgence rather than a serious expense. Theodore's breeching suit, the little jacket and trousers marking his passage out of babyhood, cost perhaps 15 shillings, tailored specially, and would be replaced within the year as he grew, because clothing a growing child properly was itself treated as an ongoing cost of respectability rather than a one-time purchase. Cecily's layette, the full set of infant clothing assembled before her birth, flannel binders, long robes, caps, would have run to several pounds all told, most of it hand-sewn or purchased new rather than passed down, because appearing to provide generously for an infant was, in households at this level of the middle class, its own quiet form of social display. None of this money passed through Nurse Hartley's hands, and very little of it accrued to her benefit beyond the warm room and the reliable meals that came with her position. For Nurse Hartley, the economics of the household she ran meant something specific and rather stark. It meant that her entire visible security, her bed, her food, her small quarterly wage, depended on the continued goodwill of 2 people she saw for perhaps 20 minutes a day and could be withdrawn on a week's notice if that goodwill ever failed. It meant that the rocking horse in the day nursery was worth, in cash terms, more than a month of her labour, and that nobody in the house, herself included, found anything strange in that arrangement, because it was simply how the world had always been arranged, as far as anyone currently living in it could remember. There is a further wrinkle to this arithmetic worth naming plainly, which is what a wage of £24 a year actually meant for a woman's prospects beyond the nursery itself. Domestic service consumed a servant's whole life in a way factory work, for all its own harshness, generally did not, and the trade-off mattered enormously to the women weighing one against the other. A girl in a Manchester cotton mill or a Bryant and May match factory in Bow might earn a comparable weekly sum, sometimes even more. But she kept her evenings, her Sundays, and crucially, the possibility of courtship and marriage on something like an ordinary timetable. A live-in nursery nurse kept none of that. Her employer's household owned her time so completely, day and night, that the ordinary path to marriage most working women expected, an evening's courting, a walk taken together on a half-day off, simply narrowed to almost nothing. This was, at bottom, one small piece of a much larger demographic puzzle that troubled the era's own commentators, who had noted for decades that England simply contained more women of marriageable age than men available to marry them, a surplus driven partly by men emigrating to the colonies in search of opportunity and partly by the ordinary arithmetic of mortality among young men in dangerous trades and distant postings. Various societies had sprung up through the 1860s and 70s to help unmarried women emigrate themselves, to Canada, to Australia, to the Cape, on the theory that a colony short of domestic servants and long-on bachelor farmers offered a woman better prospects than London ever could. Nurse Hartley had heard of such schemes, had even known a girl from her own village who sailed for Natal 8 years ago and wrote home twice a year with news of a husband and a farm, and had considered the idea herself once, in an idle hour, before deciding that a settled position and a wage she understood beat any uncertain promise on the far side of an ocean she had never crossed. Women who stayed in nursery work past 30, as Nurse Hartley now has, disproportionately stayed unmarried for exactly this reason. Not from any lack of wish for a household of their own, but because the demands of caring for other people's children left vanishingly little room to build one. Picture the household account book itself. The one Mrs. Marchmont keeps in her own hand each week, because overseeing it was considered a wife's proper domestic duty, regardless of how little of the actual work she performed. A single page might read, in order, coal 7 shillings, butcher £1 2 shillings, servants' wages for the quarter entered as a single lump sum rather than broken out by name, milk, bread, candles, a new pair of boots for Master Theodore, a subscription to a circulating library, a donation to the lying-in charity Mrs. Marchmont serves. Nurse Hartley's entire yearly value to this household appears in that book as one modest line among dozens, indistinguishable in the ledger's own arithmetic from the coal or the candles, though every person actually living under this roof would have told you, if asked plainly, that she mattered rather more than either. Her uniform itself carried its own cost, a print dress and apron for daytime, a plainer dark dress for evenings, replaced perhaps once a year, and typically deducted, in whole or in part, from her quarterly wage rather than provided free, a common arrangement that quietly shaved a further £1 or 2 off what she actually banked. Add the cost of her own boots, resoled twice a year against the daily walk to the gardens and back, and her true disposable income, once wages, deductions, and the small remittances she sends home to Norfolk are all accounted for, comes to something closer to £15 a year than 24. A sum she has, over 5 years, managed to turn into a modest savings account at the post office bank, the beginning of whatever security her working life will ever provide her. Let us return to the nursery now, because it is nearly 11 o'clock, and the morning's business is about to give way to the demands of midday. Midday in the Marchmont nursery does not mean the household dinner, which will be taken downstairs by the adults at 1:30 in a dining room the children rarely enter except on Sunday. It means, instead, the children's own dinner served in the day nursery at 12:30, a full hour and a half ahead of their parents, on the theory that small stomachs kept to small, regular hours were healthier stomachs, and on the plainer practical fact that a household could not easily manage a formal dinner service and a nursery meal in the same room at the same time. Cook sends up a plain boiled dinner today, mutton and potatoes and a spoonful of carrots, the whole tray carried up by Ivy on a journey that has by now become so routine to her that she can climb the last flight without once looking down at what she carries. Cut small for Alice, mashed further for Cecily, who by 7 months is managing more solid food than her mother would probably guess if asked, since Mrs. Marchmont has never once watched a full nursery meal from start to finish. Theodore eats without much appetite, and it is here, over the mutton, that Nurse Hartley notices the cough has changed its character since the morning. Not worse exactly, but different. A slightly hoarser edge to it that she has heard before in other children, in other Novembers, and that she has learned, painfully, not to dismiss out of hand. She does not say anything to alarm him. She simply decides, quietly, that the afternoon's plans will bend around this small new fact, and this is worth noticing, because it shows you something the printed schedule pinned inside the linen cupboard door never could. The real structure of a nursery day was not the timetable at all. It was the constant, largely invisible process of a single woman reading a room full of small, largely non-verbal signals and adjusting everything around them, hour by hour, without any of it ever being written down or credited to her. After dinner comes the rest hour, and this is one of those beats where the common picture and the real one diverge sharply. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. Imagining the Victorian nursery nurse as a stern disciplinarian, quick with a slipper, running her small kingdom on fear the way certain memoirs and certain films have taught us to expect. Some nurses undoubtedly were exactly that, and history remembers them, understandably, because cruelty leaves a mark that ordinary competence rarely does. But the more common reality, better supported by the diaries grown children left behind about the women who raised them, was something closer to what we are watching now. Alice is put down for her rest with a story rather than a scolding, a short, simple tale about a fox that lives under an old thorn hedge and outwits a farmer 3 separate times before being welcomed. In the version Nurse Hartley tells, into the farmhouse kitchen out of sheer admiration for his cleverness. She has told it perhaps 200 times by now, and has quietly begun improving it in small ways over the years, adding a detail here, cutting a slow patch there, the way any storyteller does with material they know by heart. And Alice, who has heard every version, still gasps at the third escape exactly as if she had never once heard the ending before. Theodore, too old now for a proper nap, is set to quiet play instead, his tin soldiers arranged in careful ranks along the nursery windowsill on the strict understanding that quiet is the operative word. An understanding he honours for perhaps 11 minutes before Alice, not yet asleep, begins narrating her opinion of his battle formation from her cot. Outside the window, the rain has settled into a steady, unhurried patter against the glass, the kind of sound that seems designed, on afternoons like this one, to make an indoor room feel more sheltered rather than less, and Nurse Hartley finds her own needle slowing to match its rhythm without quite noticing she has done so. There is genuine warmth in this hour, and it deserves saying plainly, because the coldness of the era's official theories about child rearing did not always translate into coldness at the level of the actual room. Nurse Hartley sits mending stockings by the window while the children settle, and there is an ease to her presence that no printed schedule could manufacture, built entirely out of 5 years of these same small rituals, repeated until they had worn a groove as comfortable as an old chair. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told alongside the wage figures and the class arrangements, the plain fact that whatever else this relationship was, built on inequality and precarity and a wage that would embarrass any modern employer, it was also, on most ordinary afternoons, something close to love, imperfect and asymmetrical, but real on both sides of it. At 2 o'clock, Ivy takes Cecily down to be shown briefly to a caller in the drawing room, one of Mrs. Marchmont's regular Tuesday visitors, because a well-turned-out infant, produced for exactly the right 5 minutes and no longer, was considered a pleasant addition to a calling day and a small credit to the household. Cecily behaves well enough for the performance, is admired, is kissed once on the forehead by a woman whose name she will never learn, and is carried back upstairs, having contributed her part to a social ritual she will not remember happening at all. The letter from Norfolk arrives with the early afternoon post, and Nurse Hartley reads it standing at the day nursery window while Alice naps, her mother's cramped, careful hand reporting the ordinary business of a village she has not seen in 3 years, a sister's new baby, the state of the autumn ploughing, a neighbour's illness that sounds, from the description, like nothing more serious than a heavy cold. There is a small enclosure, a pressed sprig of lavender from the cottage garden, which Nurse Hartley holds to her face for a moment before tucking the whole letter into her apron pocket to answer properly that evening, once the children are settled, in the same careful hand she was taught at the village school before she was old enough to be sent away to earn her keep. She will write 2 sides of thin paper by lamplight, mostly about the children, because there is very little else in her life that would strike her mother as worth the postage, and she will not mention, because it would not occur to her to mention, how rarely a full hour passes in which she is not directly responsible for someone smaller than herself. Downstairs briefly, sent to confirm the arrangements for tomorrow's washing day with the cook, Nurse Hartley finds Mrs. Dawson, who has run the Marchmont kitchen for 11 years and outranks every other servant in the house by seniority if not strictly by wage, kneading dough at the long deal table with the practiced economy of motion that comes from having made bread several thousand times before. The 2 women exchange the kind of brief. companionable shorthand that develops between servants who see each other daily but rarely have leisure to talk properly. A comment about the weather. A question about whether Master Theodore's appetite has picked up, and a side about the coal delivery expected Thursday. It is one of the only adult conversations beyond her exchanges with Ivy that Nurse Hartley will have all day, and though it lasts scarcely 3 minutes, she returns upstairs slightly lighter for it, the way anyone does after a small, ordinary moment of being spoken to as a person rather than as a function of the household's needs. Meanwhile, upstairs, Theodore's cough interrupts his soldiers twice more, and Nurse Hartley makes the decision, without consulting anyone, to keep both older children indoors for the remainder of the afternoon rather than risk a second outing into weather that has not improved. This is, in its small way, an exercise of real authority, the kind rarely acknowledged in any account of what a nursery nurse actually did all day. She cannot summon a doctor without Mrs. Marchmont's knowledge, cannot spend a shilling of household money without accounting for it, cannot alter the printed schedule in any way that would draw comment if noticed. But within the narrow space the household allows her, she makes constant, consequential judgments, dozens of them a day, about warmth, about rest, about which small symptom deserves watching and which can be safely ignored. And the household's entire faith in her rests on the accumulated evidence that her judgment over 5 years has consistently been sound. By 3, the light outside has begun its early November retreat toward dusk, and the nursery lamps are lit rather earlier than the schedule strictly calls for. There is needlework now. A hem Nurse Hartley is letting down on one of Theodore's outgrown shirts to pass along to a cousin's boy, done by lamplight with Alice, awake again, arranging wooden beads into patterns she insists have names and meanings that change every time she is asked to explain them. Ivy returns from an errand to the chemist, sent quietly by Nurse Hartley on her own initiative rather than anyone's instruction, carrying a small tin of camphorated oil, the kind kept in most nursery cupboards of the period against exactly this sort of cough, purchased for a few pence and tucked away for later rather than used immediately. Because the symptom is not yet, in Nurse Hartley's careful private assessment, bad enough to warrant it. A little after 3, a coal merchant's cart draws up outside, 2 men sliding sacks down a chute into the cellar with a low, rolling thunder that Alice finds endlessly fascinating and presses her face to the nursery window to watch, narrating the whole operation to nobody in particular. 1 sack, 2 sacks, 3 sacks, until Nurse Hartley gently draws her back from the cold glass. The delivery will keep this house warm for another 6 weeks, and it is paid for, like everything else in this household, out of an account book Nurse Hartley never sees and has no reason to see, her own concerns beginning and ending with whether the nursery's own scuttle gets its fair share once the cellar has been restocked. It is 4:30 now, and the children's tea is being laid, bread and butter, a little jam for Theodore as a small concession against his flagging spirits, milk for all 3. Outside, the rain that paused briefly around noon has returned in earnest, and somewhere below, the household is beginning its own quieter transition toward evening, the lamps being lit floor by floor. The fires built up for the hours ahead. Up here, in the 2 connected rooms at the top of the house, the day's accumulated small observations, a cough, a change in temper, a flagging appetite, are beginning to gather into something that will need, before the night is finished, Nurse Hartley's full and undivided attention. This is one of those moments where the small detail, a tin of camphorated oil bought quietly and set aside, tells a much bigger story about the medical world a Victorian nursery actually operated inside, and it is worth understanding properly before we go any further into the evening. Croup was, in 1888, one of the great domestic terrors of English childhood, a swelling and narrowing of a young child's airway, usually brought on by an ordinary cold that could turn in the space of a single night into something that frightened even calm, experienced women into action. Nobody in the Marchmont nursery nor in the vast majority of English households, understood the actual mechanism of it in terms we would recognize today. What they understood was the sound, a harsh, barking cough that every mother and every nurse of the era could identify instantly and never forgot once heard, and the folk knowledge passed down through generations of nursery women rather than through any medical textbook, of what to do about it. Camphorated oil rubbed into the chest and throat, a basin of boiling water with friar's balsam added, held near enough to let a child breathe the steam without being scalded by it. In more serious cases, a warm bread poultice, bread soaked in hot milk and wrapped in flannel, applied to the chest on the theory that heat drew out whatever was causing the trouble. None of these remedies would meet a modern medical standard, but none of them were foolish either, and several, the steam especially, offered a real if modest physiological benefit that the women applying them could not have explained but had learned, through generations of trial, to trust. Cholera belonged to a different register of fear entirely, tied in the public imagination to bad water and crowded, poorer districts rather than to a well-drained street like Chepstow Villas, but the outbreaks of earlier decades, in 1849, in 1854, in 1866, had left a lasting mark on how households like the Marchmonts approached ordinary hygiene. This is why carbolic soap sits on the nursery washstand rather than a plainer, cheaper bar. Its sharp, almost medicinal smell, one of the defining sensory facts of any Victorian nursery, used on hands, on surfaces, on anything that might carry what the era vaguely called miasma, a theory of disease transmitted through foul air that was, by 1888, beginning to lose ground to the newer germ theory, but had by no means disappeared from ordinary household practice. Nurse Hartley scrubs her hands with it a dozen times a day without being able to explain, in any scientific sense, precisely what she is protecting against. She simply knows, as every nursery woman of her generation knew, that cleanliness mattered enormously, and that a nursery kept scrupulously clean was a nursery that, more often than not, kept its children alive. Motherhood itself, in households of this kind, carried its own medical anxieties that shaped the nursery from the very first days of a child's life, long before Nurse Hartley ever entered the picture. Mrs. Marchmont had nursed none of her 3 children at her own breast for more than a few weeks, a common enough choice among women of her class, who employed a wet nurse for the earliest months on the medical advice of the era, which held that a mother's constitution, worn down as it often was by a difficult confinement, was frequently unequal to the demands of feeding an infant herself. The wet nurse who fed Cecily through her first 4 months, a young widow from Essex whose own baby had died and whose milk, therefore, came, in the blunt economic logic of the trade, cheap, has long since gone on to another situation, remembered by nobody in this house except, faintly, by Nurse Hartley, who managed the arrangement daily and who alone among the household ever learned the woman's full name. A doctor could be sent for, and would be, the moment Nurse Hartley's private assessment tipped from watchful to worried, but calling one was not a casual matter. Dr. Pierce, the family's physician, charges a guinea for an evening visit, a substantial sum that a household like the Marchmonts could certainly afford, but would not spend lightly on every passing sniffle, which meant the actual decision of when a symptom crossed from ordinary childhood complaint into genuine emergency rested, in practice, almost entirely with the nursery nurse herself. Dr. Pierce himself, when he does call, arrives by cab with a leather bag containing instruments that would look almost medieval to a modern physician, a stethoscope of the older wooden monaural kind, a case of pills compounded by his own dispensing chemist rather than manufactured to any standard formula, and a bedside manner built more on confident reassurance than on any diagnostic certainty science of the era could actually support. He listens to Theodore's chest, taps it once or twice with 2 fingers in the manner every physician of his training was taught, pronounces a verdict, and leaves again within 20 minutes. His guinea fee earned as much for the calm his visit produces in an anxious household as for anything his medicine actually accomplishes. Nurse Hartley watches these visits with a complicated mixture of respect and private skepticism, because she has, more than once across her career, watched a child recover perfectly well from something Dr. Pierce pronounced serious, and watched another slip away from something he pronounced trivial, and has learned, the way anyone doing this work long enough learns, that a doctor's confidence and a doctor's accuracy were, in 1888, two rather different things. She was not medically trained in any formal sense. She had no certificate, no examination behind her. Nothing but years of accumulated observation across however many children had passed through her care since she was 15 years old, and yet the household's entire system of health depended on her judgment being reliable, because she was the only person in the building who spent enough hours actually watching these particular children to notice the difference between an ordinary cough and one that was, quietly, becoming something worse. The numbers behind this fear are worth pausing over in their own right. In London in 1888, somewhere around 150 children out of every 1,000 born alive did not survive their first year. A figure that would strike any parent today as almost unbearable, and that struck the Marchmonts and their neighbours as a serious but ordinary hazard of family life, sad rather than shocking, the kind of loss nearly every household on this street had experienced somewhere among cousins or siblings, if not among their own children. Compulsory smallpox vaccination had been law in England for over 2 decades by this point, administered to infants in their first few months, one of the era's genuine public health triumphs, though a small but vocal movement of parents objected to it on grounds of bodily liberty that would sound entirely familiar to a modern ear. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, and whooping cough circulated through nurseries and schoolrooms with a regularity that made a household like the Marchmonts keep, without much discussion, an informal system of quarantine, a sick child kept strictly to the nursery, visitors discouraged, the family doctor consulted early rather than late, all of it managed primarily by the woman who spent her days in the room where any such illness would first show itself. There is more to understand here about what this responsibility actually cost her, beyond the physical labour of the coal and the water and the washing. Nurse Hartley's position, for all its 5 years of stability, carried no real security whatsoever. She could be dismissed with a week's notice, and the grounds for such a dismissal were entirely at the family's discretion. A reference withheld or given grudgingly, a rumour of carelessness, a simple change in the family's circumstances or preferences. If Theodore's cough worsened tonight into genuine croup and something went badly wrong, it would very likely be Nurse Hartley, not the physician summoned too late or the household's own delay in sending for him, who bore the private, unspoken judgment of having somehow failed. She carried, in other words, the full emotional weight of these children's survival, night after night, year after year, without carrying any of the formal authority, the job security, or the credit that weight would seem to demand. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told alongside the cosy image of firelight and rocking horses. The women who filled these positions across England, thousands of them, functioned as mother, nurse, and teacher all at once, and yet remained, in every legal and social sense, an employee who could be replaced by advertisement in a weekly newspaper faster than most families replaced a housemaid. They carried the emotional load of a parent without holding a parent's rights, and they carried it largely alone, in a room at the top of a tall house, with only a 15-year-old nursery maid for company and a single novel, worked through a page at a time, for whatever private inner life they managed to preserve. And when, eventually, the children they had raised grew old enough to need them no longer, when Theodore went off to school and Alice to a governess of her own, women in Nurse Hartley's position simply moved on to the next household and the next set of small strangers, carrying forward, quietly, whatever love had built up over years of exactly this kind of watching. with no ceremony to mark the parting, and no institution anywhere prepared to say that what had been lost was worth grieving. Let us go back upstairs now, because it is nearly 5 o'clock, and Theodore's cough has just changed again. It is not alarming yet, but it has taken on a slightly hollower note than it carried an hour ago, and Nurse Hartley, kneeling to help him out of his day clothes, hears it clearly enough to make her decision without needing to think it through twice. Bath tonight, earlier than usual, and the camphorated oil after all. The tin bath is dragged in front of the nursery fire and filled with cans of water carried up by Ivy, mixed carefully to a temperature Nurse Hartley tests with her own elbow before any child goes near it, the same test her own mistress taught her 15 years ago, passed down the way most of this knowledge was passed. Hand to hand, woman to woman, with no textbook involved at all. Alice goes first, delighted by the whole procedure the way 3-year-olds tend to be delighted by water in any form, splashing enough that Ivy's apron is soaked through by the time she is lifted out, wrapped in a warmed towel and set on Nurse Hartley's knee by the fire to have her hair dried strand by strand with a soft cloth. Theodore goes second, more subdued than usual, submitting to the whole business with the mild, unresisting patience of a child who does not feel entirely well and knows, somewhere underneath his 6 years of accumulated dignity, that being fussed over is not actually so bad tonight. Cecily, meanwhile, is already changed and settled into her cot by Ivy, who has developed, over her own 2 years in this house, a genuine deftness with the youngest child that Nurse Hartley notices and privately credits, though she rarely says so aloud, because praise given too freely was thought, in this era's theory of servant management, to encourage a familiarity that could undermine the whole delicate order of the household hierarchy. Ivy hums quietly to Cecily as she settles her, an old Kent tune with no words Nurse Hartley recognizes, and the baby's fussing subsides into something closer to contentment by the time the humming stops. It is when he is out of the water and wrapped in his own towel that Nurse Hartley does the thing so many accounts of this era circle back to, because it is one of the most viscerally remembered rituals of any Victorian sickroom or near sickroom. She warms a small amount of camphorated oil between her palms and works it gently into his chest and throat, the sharp, clean, faintly medicinal smell filling the space around the fire, mixing with the wet wool smell of drying towels and the softer smell of the soap Alice has been thoroughly, if inefficiently, scrubbed with. Theodore wrinkles his nose at the smell, as every child of this era apparently did, and Nurse Hartley tells him, as every nurse of this era apparently told them, that it will help him breathe easier by morning, a promise she believes with the kind of hard-won, unscientific confidence that 5 years of watching this exact remedy work, more often than not, has earned her. Both children are dressed for bed in flannel nightgowns warmed on the fireguard, soft, high-necked, ankle-length, the kind of garment that made almost no distinction between a boy's nightwear and a girl's at this age, both children still young enough to be dressed nearly identically once the day's more differentiated clothing came off. Cecily, who has had her own bath earlier and more briefly, is already drowsy in her cot, and the night nursery, through the connecting door, has taken on the hush that settles over a room where at least one occupant is closer to sleep than to waking. This is where the evening becomes, in the fullest sense, the scene most people already carry a version of in their heads, and it deserves its full weight rather than a hurried mention. Because the picture, for once, is not entirely wrong. Nurse Hartley draws a low chair between the 2 small beds and reads aloud from a battered book of nursery rhymes with a cracked spine and a cover held on with a strip of linen tape, the same book she has read from every night for as long as either child can remember, the same rhymes in very nearly the same order, because children of this age, then as now, found enormous comfort in exact repetition rather than novelty. Tonight it is the old rhyme about the man in the moon coming down too soon, and the one about the cat and the fiddle that Alice has never once let pass without a small satisfied laugh at the cow jumping over the moon, and finally the quieter one, the one Nurse Hartley always saves for last on nights when a child seems tired or unwell. A gentle, repetitive verse about hush and little lambs and the coming of sleep, worn smooth in her voice from 1,000 prior tellings. Alice mouths along with the words she has memorized without quite being able to read them herself. Theodore, propped against his pillow, listens with his eyes half closed, and Nurse Hartley reads a little more softly than usual tonight, pitching her voice down toward the hush a sickly child seems to need without either of them ever discussing why. After the rhymes come the prayers, said kneeling at the bedside, Theodore's own small hands folded with the exaggerated care of a boy who has been taught that this posture matters, Alice's prayers rather shorter and considerably less theologically precise, ending, as they generally do, with a request that God look after her rocking horse in the day nursery next door, a request Nurse Hartley receives with the same grave attention she gives to every other part of the ritual. Because a child's prayers, however small their content, were treated in this era as serious business in their own right. Not performance for an audience, but a real, if simple, practice of the soul that she was expected to guide as carefully as she guided anything else about their upbringing. And then the room grows quiet, properly quiet, the fire settling into that steady, low-burning rhythm that says it will hold through the coming hours without much tending. This is one of those moments where the cozy version of the story and the honest one are, for once, telling us the same thing. There really was warmth here. There really was a woman who loved these children in whatever complicated, asymmetrical way her position allowed, who read the same rhymes every single night, because she understood, better than the printed schedule ever could, that the repetition itself was the comfort. My friend, if you have ever sat beside a child's bed at the end of a long day and felt the tiredness that comes only from caring for someone smaller than yourself, you already understand something about Nurse Hartley that no history book could teach you nearly so well. Mrs. Marchmont comes up briefly, as she does most evenings, though not every one, to kiss each child once more before their eyes fully close, a soft rustle of good silk on the nursery stairs announcing her before she appears, a few murmured words to Theodore about his cough, a promise to look in again before her own bed if he seems worse. It is a short visit, 5 minutes at most, and it is, in its small way, entirely genuine, the limited but real warmth of a mother operating inside a system that gave her very little practical role in her children's daily lives, but had not, for all that, extinguished her actual feeling for them. She leaves a soft trace of scent behind her on the landing, and the house below begins settling into its own evening quiet. Lamps dimmed floor by floor, the last of the household's business concluding for the night. By 7:30, both older children are asleep. Theodore's breathing settled into something steadier than it held at dinner, and Cecily has been down for over an hour already. Ivy banks the day nursery fire and retires to her own small room off the night nursery. And Nurse Hartley is, for the first time since 6:15 that morning, alone. This is the hour we began with, 8 o'clock, and we have now caught up with ourselves. Rain against the window, fire in the grate, a woman settling into a wicker chair positioned exactly between the 2 cots and the narrow crib, close enough to reach any of the 3 children in a single movement, angled so that the single dim oil lamp on the table beside her falls across her mending basket and not across the children's closed eyes. This is where the night's true work begins, quieter than anything we have watched so far, and in some ways heavier for being so quiet. She takes up a sock of Theodore's, a heel gone through at the same spot it always goes through, and begins to darn it by the low, amber light, her needle moving in the small, practiced rhythm of a task she could perform in complete darkness if she had to. The wicker chair creaks once when she shifts her weight, a specific pitch of creak she has learned over years to control, easing her weight forward and back in ways that keep the sound to a single soft note rather than the sharper complaint that might carry into a sleeping child's dreams and disturb them. Outside, the storm that has threatened all evening finally commits to itself properly, rain driving hard against the glass in gusts, occasionally rattling the sash in its frame, and somewhere below, on the wet black street, a late cab passes, its wheels hissing against the cobbles before the sound fades back into the general hush of the rain. At 9, she rises to check the children, the first of what will be perhaps a dozen such rounds before the sky begins to lighten. Cecily first, a light hand against the crib rail, a moment's watching to confirm the small chest is rising and falling in its proper rhythm. Alice next, blankets straightened where 3-year-old limbs have already worked them loose, a soft murmur that does not quite wake her. Theodore last, because he is the one she has been watching most closely all evening, where Nurse Hartley's hand goes not to the blanket first but to his forehead, testing for the heat that would mean the day's small, watchful worry has become something else entirely. Cool, or cool enough. She lets her hand rest there a moment longer than strictly necessary, less because the extra second tells her anything more, and more because the contact itself, the simple fact of a warm hand against a sleeping child's brow, is a comfort she allows herself as much as him. Somewhere past 10, in the small room off the night nursery where Ivy sleeps, Nurse Hartley hears the girl talking softly in her sleep. Not words exactly, just a low murmuring rhythm, and she wonders, not for the first time, what a 15-year-old girl sent away from a Kent small holding dreams about on an ordinary wet Tuesday. Ivy has mentioned, once or twice, in the unguarded way of someone still young enough to say such things aloud, that she would like eventually to be a proper nurse herself, with charges of her own, a room like this one to run, and Nurse Hartley has encouraged her in it plainly, because she remembers being 15 and wanting exactly the same modest, entirely reasonable thing. A settled position, a trade she was good at. Some small corner of a large house that was, in whatever limited sense the arrangement allowed, hers at midnight, the fire wants tending, and she rises stiffly from the wicker chair, her joints protesting faintly after so long spent still, and builds the fire back up quietly with a few pieces of coal added one at a time rather than all at once, because a sudden flare of new coal could crackle loud enough to wake a light sleeper. And because the whole art of a good-night nurse, if anyone had ever thought to write it down as a proper trade, was this exact skill, doing everything the room required without the room ever quite noticing it had been done. Theodore stirs and coughs twice, a rougher sound than she would like, and she is at his bedside within seconds, propping him half upright against an extra pillow. On the folk wisdom, sound as far as it goes, that an upright position eases a tight chest better than lying flat. She warms a little more of the camphorated oil between her palms and works it once more into his throat and chest, murmuring something too quiet for us to make out. Some small, wordless comfort more in the tone than in the meaning, and he settles, coughs once more, and slides back down into a heavier, steadier sleep than before. Somewhere in the middle of that long stretch, needle moving, rain falling, Nurse Hartley finds herself thinking of a boy she nursed years ago, before the Marchmonts, a delicate child in her second situation who did not recover from a winter fever the way Theodore, tonight, plainly will, and whose small face she has not thought of in weeks, but who returns to her now, as he does most nights when a cough in this room runs a little longer than she would like. She does not dwell on it. There is no dwelling to be done, only the old, familiar discipline of noting the memory, letting it pass through her without stopping to be handled, and returning her attention to the room she is actually sitting in, where the breathing around her remains steady and the fire remains warm. This, too, was part of the work nobody wrote down, the carrying forward of every child who had ever frightened her, quietly, alongside every child currently in her care. There is more to understand here about what this hour actually demanded of her, because it asked for a kind of vigilance that never fully rested even when nothing at all was happening. Between 1 and 2 in the morning, she checks the children twice more, adjusts the fire once, and finishes the sock she began at 8, moving on to a torn seam in one of Alice's petticoats by the time the small clock on the mantel reads 2:30. The rain has not eased. If anything, it has grown heavier, drumming now in long unbroken sheets against the glass, and beneath that steady sound, the house itself has gone entirely silent. The parents long asleep 2 floors below, the rest of the servants asleep in their own rooms further down, the whole considerable machinery of the household reduced, at this hour, to 1 small fire and 1 woman keeping watch over 3 sleeping children who trust her, in the wordless, total way only a child that age can trust anyone, to keep the night itself from reaching them. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it produces no dramatic incident worth recording, no crisis, no rescue, nothing a diary or a letter home would think worth mentioning. It produced only this: a steady, unglamorous vigilance, repeated every night, that asked a woman to remain half awake for hours at a time against the possibility of a danger that, on most nights, including this one, never fully arrived. Theodore's cough, by 3 in the morning, has eased into something ordinary, ragged still but no longer hollow, no longer the sound that made Nurse Hartley reach for the camphor twice in one evening. Whatever this had threatened to become, it has, by the deepest hour of the night, quietly decided not to. And there is something in that outcome worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Nothing happened tonight, in the sense that a storyteller usually means the word. Nobody was saved from anything dramatic. A boy had a bad cough, was cared for with real skill and real tenderness by a woman whose whole training was 5 years of watching children exactly like him, and by the deep hours of the morning he was simply, quietly, better. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, very nearly the whole of what this work was, night after night, in nursery after nursery, across this city and this era. An entire invisible profession built on making sure that nothing happened, that the ordinary dangers of an ordinary childhood passed by without becoming anything worse, 1 attentive hour at a time. There are unspoken bonds built in hours like these, the kind that never made it into any household ledger or any wage negotiation, because they had no market value at all. Theodore will not remember, as a grown man, the specific taste of camphor or the specific creak of that 1 wicker chair. But something in him, something formed in these exact hours, in this exact room, by this exact woman's hands, will carry forward regardless, the way the deepest kinds of care always do, quietly, beneath the level where memory usually keeps its records. Between 3 and 4, the rain settles into its longest, steadiest stretch of the whole night, no longer driving in gusts but falling in a single unbroken curtain that seems, after so many hours of listening to it, to have become simply the sound the world makes now. A low, continuous hush against the glass that any of us, hearing it long enough on a night like this one, would eventually stop noticing as sound at all and start receiving instead as something closer to silence or to sleep itself arriving early. Nurse Hartley's hands have gone cool despite the fire, the familiar chill that settles into fingers held still too long over fine needlework, and she flexes them once, quietly, before setting the mending aside for the night, her eyes moving, out of long habit rather than any fresh worry, across the 3 small shapes, breathing steadily in the dark around her. By 4, the storm has begun, finally, to loosen its grip, the rain softening from a drumming sheet to something closer to a steady patter, and the fire in the grate has burned down to a small, dense bed of red coals that will hold their heat for hours yet, without further tending. Nurse Hartley allows herself, for the first time since 8 the previous evening, to sit back fully in the wicker chair rather than perch at its edge, her mending finished, her rounds complete, 3 children breathing steadily in the dark around her. It is nearly time for the night to begin, in its own quiet way, letting go of its grip on this one small room at the top of a very tall house. That small tin of camphorated oil, sitting now nearly empty on the mantel beside the clock, opens a door into something larger than one boy's cough on one wet November night. Let us walk through it, because 1888 sits at a hinge point in this story that the people living through it could only half sense, and understanding what was shifting beneath Nurse Hartley's feet tells us something true about where her whole trade was headed. The medical world she works inside is, without her quite knowing it, already beginning to change underneath her. Joseph Lister had demonstrated the principles of antiseptic surgery 2 decades earlier, and Robert Koch had identified the specific bacterium responsible for tuberculosis only 6 years before this November. Discoveries that were steadily, unevenly, replacing the old miasma theory of foul air with a new understanding of specific, identifiable germs. That understanding had not yet fully reached a Bayswater nursery. Nurse Hartley still scrubs with carbolic soap because her training told her cleanliness mattered, not because anyone had explained to her precisely why, and she still reaches for camphor and steam because 5 years of results have earned her trust in them. Not because she could diagram the biology of a swollen airway. But the science was moving, quickly by the standards of the century, and within another generation, the vague, inherited folk wisdom of the nursery would begin giving way to something closer to what we would recognize as pediatric medicine, with trained physicians specializing in children's illness in a way that, in 1888, remained rare enough that Dr. Pierce treats the whole Marchmont family, young and old, without any specialty in children at all. Ideas about early childhood itself were shifting too, quietly, in circles the Marchmont household would not encounter directly for years yet. The German educator Friedrich Froebel, dead now for over 3 decades, had argued that young children learned best through structured play rather than rote instruction, and his kindergarten movement had been slowly, unevenly crossing into England since the 1850s, first among reformers and eventually, by the coming 90s, into ordinary middle-class nurseries which would gradually come to look less like miniature schoolrooms with slates and sums, and more like the deliberately playful learning environments a modern parent would recognize instantly. Theodore's careful, rather joyless practice with his squeaking pencil belonged to the older model, the one about to be quietly, gradually displaced. The profession Nurse Hartley practices, if we can even call it that yet, stood on the edge of its own quiet transformation. 4 years after this evening, in 1892, a woman named Emily Ward would found the Norland Institute in London, the first establishment to offer formal, certificated training in the care of young children, teaching hygiene, basic physiology, early education, and nursery management to young women who wanted to enter this work with something more than inherited household lore behind them. Nurse Hartley herself, 37 by then, would very likely be considered too old and too settled to retrain, and would go on doing exactly what she has always done, learnt hand to hand rather than from any certificate. But the girls coming up behind her, girls like Ivy, 15 years old tonight and mending her own apprenticeship the old way, would increasingly have the option of a different path into this same work, one that came with a diploma, a slightly higher wage, and the beginnings of professional standing that Nurse Hartley's entire generation of nursery women had simply never been offered. Barely 3 months before this evening, in the summer of 1888, some 1,400 women and girls employed at the Bryant and May match factory in Bow, not 4 miles from where Nurse Hartley now sits, had walked out of their jobs over starvation wages and the horrific industrial disease their work exposed them to, and had won, astonishingly, against a company that had assumed such women had no organized voice at all. The strike had been reported in nearly every newspaper the Marchmont household received, and it represented something new stirring in English working life. Proof that women without property, without education, without any of the advantages Mrs. Marchmont enjoyed, could organize themselves and force a concession from power that had never previously troubled to ask their opinion about anything. Domestic servants, isolated from one another inside individual households in a way factory workers never were, would not organize in anything like the same fashion for decades yet. The nature of the work made it nearly impossible. But the match girls' strike belonged to the same current of change that would eventually reach women like Nurse Hartley too. A good deal later and a good deal more slowly. but reach her all the same. There is more to understand here about the wider currents moving through English society in this exact decade. Currents that would eventually reach even a quiet nursery at the top of a Bayswater townhouse. The Married Women's Property Act, passed 6 years before this evening, had only recently given married women like Mrs. Marchmont the legal right to own and control property in her own name. A right her own mother did not fully possess. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson had qualified as a physician decades earlier and was, by 1888, running a hospital staffed and led by women in London, proof, still contested in most drawing rooms of the era, that women could practice medicine at the highest level rather than merely nurse its consequences. And a slow, patient movement for women's suffrage, decades from any actual victory, was gathering the arguments and the organizing experience it would eventually need, arguments that drew, whether its leaders always acknowledged it or not, on exactly the kind of unpaid and underpaid domestic labor that women like Nurse Hartley performed every night of their working lives. For Theodore, Alice, and Cecily, the children sleeping around her as the fire burns down. This hinge point in history would shape lives none of them could yet imagine from inside their small beds. The Elementary Education Act of 1880 had made schooling compulsory to the age of 10 only 8 years before this night, which meant Theodore, unlike his father before him, would attend a proper school as a matter of legal requirement rather than family preference, though a boy of his background would likely have gone regardless. Alice would grow up inside the first stirrings of what later commentators would call the New Woman, a shift in expectations about what a respectable young woman might do with her education and her time that would touch her life by the 1890s in ways her mother's generation had barely begun to imagine. And Cecily, born in 1888 itself, would come of age in a century that looked, by its final years, only partially like the one her parents had grown up inside. She would be 30 years old before any woman in England could vote at all, and past 40 before that right extended to women on the same terms as men. Milestones that lay so far beyond this rainy November night that nobody rocking her cot tonight could have named a single date connected to them. She would, in all likelihood, never once think of her own infancy as historically significant, and yet she was, at 7 months old, already living directly inside the slow argument her country was having with itself about what a woman's life was permitted to include. None of this touched the nursery directly, on this wet night. Nurse Hartley's world remained, for now, exactly what it had been for 5 years. The same fire, the same schedule, the same narrow iron bed, but the ground beneath her trade was shifting in ways that would, within a generation, change what a woman in her position could expect, what training she might receive, what wage she might command, and what respect her work might eventually be granted, slowly and incompletely as that recognition tended to arrive. She was, without any way of knowing it, standing near the exact midpoint between one world in which her knowledge passed entirely by word of mouth and her status remained entirely at her employer's discretion, and another world, still decades off, in which the care of children would come to be recognized, at least partially, as the skilled professional work it had always actually been. Let us return to the nursery one last time tonight, because the fire is very low now, and the deepest part of the night has nearly passed. Nurse Hartley sits very still in the wicker chair, mending finished, the 3 children breathing steadily around her, the fire down to its last generous handful of coals, and for a moment she is not thinking about camphor or wages or the printed schedule pinned inside the linen cupboard door. She is simply watching the fire settle, the way anyone who has kept a long vigil eventually allows themselves a few minutes of stillness once the worst of the watching is behind them. We have followed her now through an entire day, from the cold grate at 6:15 in the morning to this same grate, nearly spent, in the small hours of the following one, through washing and dressing, through breakfast eaten in fragments, through Kensington Gardens and letters and lessons, through mutton and mending and camphor and rhymes said by heart. through a whole quiet catalogue of small tasks that no single one of them would strike anybody as remarkable, and that together added up to the entire visible shape of a woman's working life. Before we finish this night together, let us step back from the day itself and look at the shape it makes when you set it down whole. Because a single day, watched closely enough, tends to reveal patterns that no single hour inside it ever quite shows on its own. The first pattern is the sheer density of obligation that filled every hour of her waking life, with almost no gap left unclaimed by someone else's need. From the moment she rose to tend the fire before the children woke, to the moment she finally sat back in this chair past 4 in the morning, there was scarcely a quarter hour that belonged to her alone. Even her breakfast came in fragments between spoonfuls fed to a fretful infant. Even her reading, that single novel, worked through a page at a time above her narrow bed, existed only in the cracks between other people's demands. This was not unique to Nurse Hartley. It was the defining structural feature of domestic service across the whole of this era, an arrangement in which a person's entire waking existence became the raw material for someone else's comfort, with remarkably little of it reserved for anything the servant herself might have chosen. The second pattern is the invisibility of the labor itself, the way an entire day's worth of skilled, exhausting, genuinely difficult work produced, as its finished result, an impression of effortlessness. The household below saw only a nursery that ran smoothly, children who appeared clean and fed and reasonably content, a general sense that everything simply happened as it should. Nobody downstairs watched the 4 trips up 4 flights of stairs carrying hot water, or the private calculation behind the decision to keep 2 children indoors on a wet afternoon, or the hours of darning completed by lamplight while 3 children slept. The very success of Nurse Hartley's work meant that most of it went entirely unseen, which is perhaps the oldest and cruelest irony built into any form of care work, then or now. Do it well enough, and it disappears. Fail even once, visibly, and it becomes, briefly, the only thing anyone remembers about you. The third pattern is the peculiar gap between the responsibility Nurse Hartley actually carried and the authority she was formally granted to carry it. She made real medical judgments every day, deciding when a cough warranted concern and when it did not. Decisions with genuine consequences for a child's health and, potentially, survival. And yet she could not summon a physician without permission, could not alter so much as an hour of the printed schedule without risking comment, and held no legal standing whatsoever in relation to the children she had, in every practical sense, raised. This gap between capability and permission ran through nearly every aspect of her position, and it is worth noticing how familiar that same shape remains, in other forms, in other workplaces, well beyond the boundaries of any Victorian nursery. It is the shape of any job where the person doing the actual work is trusted completely with the task, and not at all with the credit or the authority that ought, by rights, to accompany it. A shape that has simply changed its costume across the intervening century rather than disappearing altogether. The fourth pattern is the economics of appearance that underwrote the entire household. The fact that a family's visible respectability, its rocking horse and its wallpaper and its full complement of 6 servants, was purchased through arrangements that would strike us now as fairly stark. A woman entrusted with 3 children's whole daily existence earning, across a full year, less than the cost of the wallpaper in the room where she was never permitted to sit. This was not hidden or disguised in 1888. It was simply the accepted shape of the world, unremarked upon by nearly everyone living inside it, which tells you something important about how thoroughly an unequal arrangement can come to feel like common sense once enough people have agreed, tacitly, never to examine it too closely. The rocking horse was not purchased in secret or defended against scrutiny. It sat in plain view of the very woman whose wages it dwarfed, and nobody involved, including Nurse Hartley herself most evenings, thought to find the arrangement strange, because a whole society had spent generations building the scaffolding that made it feel, instead, like the natural order of things. And the fifth pattern, perhaps the quietest of all, is the mediated nature of the relationships that filled this house. Theodore and Alice and Cecily loved their mother, and their mother loved them in whatever manner her own upbringing had taught her that love should properly look like, largely at a remove, delivered in brief morning visits and a goodnight kiss, rather than in the accumulated thousands small daily gestures that actually built a child's sense of safety in the world. Those gestures came instead through Nurse Hartley, a woman paid to provide them, which does not make them false. It only means that the deepest, most formative relationship in these children's early lives ran through an employee rather than through either parent, an arrangement so ordinary across this entire class of English society that almost nobody living through it thought to ask whether it made any sense. Theodore will grow into a man who remembers his mother with respect and his nurse with something closer to love, and will very likely never once, across the whole of his life, examine why those two feelings settled where they did. Because the arrangement that produced them will strike him, as it struck his parents before him, as simply how families of his kind were run. There is a sixth pattern worth naming before we finish, quieter than the other five, and harder to fit into a single sentence, which is the way genuine tenderness and genuine exploitation sat inside the very same relationship without either one cancelling the other out. It would be simpler, in a way, if this story divided cleanly into villains and victims, if the Marchmonts were cruel or Nurse Hartley resentful, if the wages were simply theft and the affection simply performance. None of that is true. Mrs. Marchmont loved her children within the limits her own upbringing had drawn around her, and Nurse Hartley loved them without any limits at all beyond the ones a servant's exhaustion imposed, and both of these loves were entirely real, coexisting inside an arrangement that was, by any fair modern reckoning, badly unequal. Understanding this era honestly means holding both facts at once, refusing the comfort of a simple verdict in either direction, because the people who lived this life did not experience it as a simple verdict either. A modern viewer wanting a clean moral, a villain to blame, or a victim to rescue, will come away from this story slightly unsatisfied, and that dissatisfaction is, itself, worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. Most lives, then and now, resist the tidy shape a story wants to give them. They experienced it mostly the way Nurse Hartley experienced this one long day, as work, and worry, and small satisfactions, and a bone-deep tiredness, and love, all tangled together in a single ordinary Tuesday that nobody involved thought to write down. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one nursery or one family. They describe a whole society's answer to a question it had largely stopped asking out loud, which was simply this: who actually does the daily work of raising a child, and what does that work cost the person who performs it, set against what it is worth to everyone who benefits from it? In 1888, the honest answer involved a woman named, in our story, Constance Hartley, 33 years old, unmarried, £24 a year. 5 years into a household she would likely serve for several more, holding the entire practical weight of 3 young lives in her steady, chapped, capable hands. It is 4 o'clock in the morning now, and we should return, one final time, to the room where we began this evening together. The rain has softened almost to nothing, a thin patter against the glass rather than the driving sheets of an hour ago. And outside, a proper London fog has rolled in off the river to fill the space the storm has vacated, thick and yellow-grey, even in darkness, wrapping the gas lamps along Chepstow Villas in soft blurred halos that barely reach the wet pavement below. Somewhere beneath that fog, a nightcab makes its slow way home, and a milk cart, hours from its first delivery, stands harnessed and waiting in a mews 2 streets over. The whole of Bayswater is asleep, and the whole of London beyond it, 4 million people given over, for these few hours, to whatever rest the century allowed them. 2 floors below, Mr. and Mrs. Marchmont sleep in a well-appointed room warmed by embers of its own, entirely unaware that a boy's cough kept a woman awake in a wicker chair for the better part of 6 hours tonight. Because that unawareness was, in its own way, the entire point of the arrangement, the thing their household paid for as surely as it paid for coal or bread. Further down, past the drawing room with its curtains still drawn against the night, past the dining room where tomorrow's breakfast things are already half laid. The cook and the housemaid and the parlour-maid sleep in their own narrow rooms, and the manservant has long since gone home through streets grown quiet enough that his own footsteps were, an hour ago, very nearly the only sound on them. The whole considerable machine of this household, 6 servants and a family of 5, lies still now, held together through the night by nothing more than habit and trust and the low fires banked in 6 separate grates. Inside, the fire in the nursery grate has burned down to its last handful of coals, a low, steady red that will hold until Ivy rises to build it up again in barely 2 hours. Theodore sleeps on his side now, his breathing even. The cough that worried Nurse Hartley through the evening reduced to nothing worse than an occasional soft catch in his throat. Alice has kicked free of her blanket again, and Nurse Hartley draws it back over her small shoulders one last time before she finally, properly, allows her own eyes to close for a while in the wicker chair. Not sleep exactly, but the nearest thing to it that her position permits. Somewhere out past the fog, a night watchman calls the hour along an adjoining street, his voice muffled almost to nothing by the thick, wet air, and a church clock answers a beat later with 4 slow, heavy strokes that seem to travel a long way before they arrive. Nurse Hartley hears both, faintly, without opening her eyes fully, and lets them pass through her the way she has let every sound of this long night pass through her. Noted, weighed, and released. In an hour, perhaps 2, Ivy will stir in the small room next door, and the fire will need building up properly again, and the whole quiet machinery of the household will begin turning back toward morning. For now, none of that has started yet. On the linen cupboard door downstairs, unseen by anyone at this hour, the printed schedule waits with tomorrow's hours already assigned, rising at 6:30, lessons at 10, dinner at 12:30, the whole pattern ready to begin again in barely 2 hours' time, before this night has even properly finished settling into memory. That is the quiet, circular truth of a life like Nurse Hartley's. One day closes only far enough to let the next one start, and the space between them, here, in the deepest hour before dawn, is really the only rest she is given at all. If you have stayed with us this long, my friend, I hope something of this room has settled into you the way it settled, most nights, into the 3 children who slept inside it. There is a kind of safety that comes from knowing someone is awake and watching so that you do not have to be. Someone tending the fire, someone listening for your breathing to change. Someone who will not let the cold or the dark or the wet November night reach you while you rest. You do not have a coal fire beside you tonight, and you do not have a woman in a wicker chair counting your breaths. But wherever you are, whatever hour has found you, whatever the day behind you asked of you, you are, for tonight, exactly as safe as those 3 children were. The obligations waiting on your own version of that linen cupboard door, whatever they are, can wait exactly the way the Marchmont households did, quiet and unread until morning actually arrives. You are allowed, just as Theodore and Alice and Cecily were, to let go of the day now, fully, and rest. The house is quiet, the street beyond it is dark, wrapped in fog that will not lift for hours yet. Somewhere below, a clock ticks on toward 5, patient and unhurried. In a hallway nobody is awake to hear. Tomorrow begins again before today has quite finished, the way it always does, the way it always will. But that is tomorrow's story, and it can wait. For tonight, the fire holds. The children sleep, Nurse Hartley rests, at last in her chair between them. And so, Now, should you?